Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to Guilty Games. We are here in Satisfactory. I have set up a rather large platform with some example train layouts. What I wanted to talk about in this video is basically the advantages and disadvantages of certain kinds of layouts, whether you use one rail and let a train move back and forth, or a loop, or some other complex hybrid. So we won't be talking about train length and how many train cars and which car we're loading material into versus removing it. Maybe I'll do another video on that another time. The focus on this video is going to be entirely around what are the advantages and disadvantages of those specific layouts and how do you signal them. So we're going to cover block signals and path signals as well. Based on the layout, because really signaling and the layout are tied together as far as which one. Block signals are much easier to use than path signals for most. So I'm only going to use path signals when they are absolutely required or if they provide some kind of advantage, and we'll talk about those individually when we get that far. For the first example, I'm going to focus us on this first layout, which is just on the far left here, kind of in the middle of the screen. You can see we've got a single straight rail and we have a single train. Now, I don't want you to confuse train versus locomotive. A train is a fully connected unit that moves together. The locomotive is the actual part that provides propulsion. In our case, electric locomotives. There's one on the front and one on the back with a freight container in between on this particular layout. Now for this layout, just imagine that track, wandering its way through the terrain to go back and forth between the factory closest to us. That's our imaginary factory stop. And at the other end, go ahead and get a little closer. You can see that we have a station here that is supposedly bringing us iron. So this is the concept. We've got a long track we've just created, we've laid one track and we put a train on it and we want it to go back and forth. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of that kind of a setup? So let's take a look. So I generally refer to this as a bidirectional straight rail, although it can curve through the terrain. Advantages: on the left there, you can see it's a low material cost. If you're low on steel, which is what it takes to actually create the track, it is a little cheaper to set up, though that's going to be offset by the fact that you actually need two locomotives attached to your train a little bit as far as just general material cost goes. But that long rail is very, very easy to run because it is simply one rail. It's also very narrow, being only one rail wide. We can run that through very tight spaces, caves even. So it has that advantage. For disadvantages, it works best if you only have two stations using this model. You can do it with more. You can have stations in the middle and have it go in a complex route out to get iron, back to the factory, out to get copper, which may be past iron. We're going to drive through it and go get copper, or we're going to pick up iron and copper, then come back. But it is best used if you have exactly two stations. You are forever limited to one train on this track. There is no way, signaling can't save you here. You simply can't put a second train on this kind of a layout. So that means that ultimately it is limited on its throughput, how much material it can actually move, because you're always limited to one train. So I don't actually recommend this except for in well-planned and well-understood scenarios where you know how much throughput you're going to need and you know for a fact you will never need to expand or use that rail for anything else. Maybe another train going to two different locations. This is not very expandable, but it is very useful in those certain limited scenarios. Now, how do we tell a train to go back and forth? I'll cover this kind of thing real quick. We actually go into a train station, go to the timetable. We pick the train. In this case, my train is called Double Trouble. And then we can see here its timetable. It's going back and forth. As soon as it completes the stops you've configured, it just goes back to the beginning. So it's going to get iron, bringing it back to the factory, and then it'll just repeat that process. If I actually edit the timetable, we can see here that I've got the 2 stops, and they can be just added or removed. There's more complex setup in here. Not going to get into that in this video. For now, our focus is entirely on train layouts and not station management. So I'm going to go ahead and back out of here. So a train itself only understands its routing in terms of what's my next stop and can I get there. And that's going to be important as we move forward in discussing things a little bit further, is understanding how a train thinks, for lack of a better term. I can't think of anything better than that right now. But essentially a train looks for its next stop and then looks to see if it has signals telling it whether it can get where it needs to go or if it can just move on. Because there's only one train on this track, because that's all it supports, this train can freely move back and forth and never needs signaling. So that's another beauty of this setup, is you never have to worry about signals in this setup. The train's simply going to move very, very efficiently back and forth, nothing going to stop it. We just can't expand easily. Since there are no signals needed there, we can go ahead and move on to the next one. So let me drift on over, and I'll give you a little bit of an aerial view here so you can actually see what's going on here. Now, much like the previous example, we have a straight rail in the center that is bidirectional. This train has to move in both directions, but it's not going forward and reverse. What happens now is when the train leaves the station here, you can see it, our imaginary factory station, it's going to leave and it's going to go forward. And it's going to go around that teardrop, and it's going to go the opposite direction that it came, down that straight single piece of track. And it's going to go down to its little iron station, pick up iron, and then it's going to turn around on the teardrop down there. Now let's talk about advantages and disadvantages on this kind of a layout. Don't mind the marked concrete. You can see the little brown sections. That's just me spacing things out for how to draw a curve. I'll cover how to lay out train tracks in another video. On this one, we're going to stay focused on what we've been talking about. Okay, so I refer to this one as a bidirectional teardrop. It can be a little more complex. You can have other stations in the middle. Ultimately, I do not recommend ever building one of these. The gain you get from being able to use multiple trains, because we can put multiple trains on this if we set up signaling, that's all you really get though. From the disadvantage side, multiple trains requires path signals. You can't use block signals for this kind of a setup. It will simply still provide the opportunity for multiple trains to collide. And that's kind of one of the main reasons for signaling, is to prevent trains from colliding. Once you do have multiple trains on this kind of bidirectional teardrop, you actually get very inefficient train movement, because that center section being shared could be very long. That could be multiple kilometers, for example, halfway across the map or all the way across the map. And that means that when a train is inside of that segment, we would want our signals to tell other trains they can't come into that segment. And that means that the majority of the track in most layouts is not going to be usable by 2 trains at the same time. And that is very unfortunate. It kind of eliminates a lot of the efficiency gains from having multiple trains. If you have a small layout and only a few stations, and you only really need 2 trains to move the materials around, or at least a very small number, this can work. That said, out of all the options, I consider this the absolute worst, and I would never do it. Simply would never do it. Path signals, because they would be required here, are also harder to implement and can cause a lot of confusion. So block signals are easier to use. So especially early on, don't fall into this trap of just reconnecting your train line coming out of the station back onto the line you came in on going the opposite direction. Just simply don't do that. It will probably cause you more headache than it's worth. If you're up for a challenge and you want to learn how path signals work, this one's not a terrible one to use them on, but it really doesn't provide any advantages. It's required because of the bidirectionality and the complexity of its intersections, whereas we can pretty much use block signals on every other kind of layout, and they're much easier to use. I mentioned earlier that we would be setting up signals and going through that. I want to come back to the bidirectional teardrop setup. I don't want to signal that just yet because it is rather complicated because of its need of requirements of using pathing signals. I want to stick to block signals and show you just how much you can do with those first, and then we'll come back to this and show you how to set up pathing signals and where else we can use them to gain some advantage. So first, let's talk about a real basic loop. Now this loop, if you imagine this going through the terrain in your layout, it can go anywhere, it can have any number of stations on it. Very straightforward, but what this does for us is, with a single train, obviously no signals are needed. If we wanted to add a second train, we would have to implement signals. But we could actually add even more than 2 trains here. We can have many trains into this kind of layout. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages here. As far as advantages of the basic loop, you have a single direction per rail, so it's very easy to use. And if we want to add multiple trains, as I mentioned, all we need is block signals. We don't need path signals. We can have unlimited stations attached to this loop, so it's pretty convenient as far as expansion. If we need more throughput, we add more trains, running the same route. If we need more stations, we just implement them right on the rail. We can reroute portions of the rail very easily. It's not all that bad of an initial layout, but there are some downsides. It does require more room than our previous examples, which isn't too big of a deal, but we have no way for trains to bypass each other. So let's take a look at this. See this train pulling into the station here, into the factory. If another train were behind it, once we have signals set up, will be stopped and not allowed to enter the station. And it has to wait until this train loads or unloads, whatever it's doing here, and then it moves on before the other train can go. And so that slows down our throughput quite a bit. Time is throughput on trains. On top of that, the second imaginary train would also have to pass through this station, even though it doesn't really need to be there necessarily. Maybe it is, but not all stations. So there's a bit of an inefficiency here in trains piling up, waiting for each other, because they have no way to bypass. So having no way to bypass, and because of how easy it is to create a bypass for a station, I don't recommend this layout. It does work, but I don't recommend it because your ability to expand and add more trains onto the same train track that you already laid just isn't worth it. We'll take a look at the next example, which will kind of show us how to do that in a bit. But first, I wanted to cover how to set up signaling so we can add multiple trains to this loop. It uses block signals, and it's very, very easy to do. All right. So how do we set up signaling for this kind of a loop? It's very, very straightforward. On this setup, we want to think in terms of we need to stop other trains. They're going to be going the same direction, but we need to make sure that trains, when they're in an area, don't have another train come up and run into them from behind. And right now, if we were to just add another train here, there's going to be a collision. So how do we prevent that? That's where signals come in. So the first thing that I want to think in terms of doing is we're going to grab a block signal, and we're going to put a block right here so that it will turn red when another train is approaching if there's a train inside the station. Now, I haven't clicked yet. I'm kind of just holding that here on purpose. I want you to look at the color of the rails. It's showing that they're all red when I have this block signal chosen. See how all the rails in our current loop are all red? The red doesn't mean anything in and of itself, the color, but what it's trying to do is identify the different block segments of the rails for you. It's showing you that all of this track is a single segment. So if I put down only one block signal right there, that block signal doesn't have a second signal. that's the problem with it, is that it can't really do anything with just one signal. It states that the signal loops onto itself. That essentially, when you put a block signal down, it's looking forward on the rail and trying to find the next block signal. If it makes it all the way around to itself, then it doesn't have everything it needs. If we grab another block signal now, and I'm just gonna put it right there. Now you see how it changed? It might be a little hard to see, but it changed that segment of the rail orange, and this segment is red. And I'm holding this block signal just so you can see the colors. And I'm gonna go ahead and drop that. Now look what we have. We have the signals are now working. This one is telling this train that's approaching that you're green, you can pull out of the station. That one's saying it's red. It's not letting the train continue. It just turned green though because the train cleared this block of track. This whole segment is now clear because it's between the two block signals. This is what a block effectively is, or at least a good way to think of it, is that it is a segment of the rail that a train can be in, and it reserves that segment so that nothing will come in and collide with it. And you can see the signals change. Right now this whole segment is red. No other train can get in there, but there could be a train here that would be allowed to enter the station. So this didn't do a lot for us. But if we come down to the other station, and we do the same thing, just by establishing a couple of block signals, right there, and right there. Now you notice it changed. I'm going to hold this block signal here just so we can see there's a red segment, there's this nice green segment here, and if we look up here, this one is yellow. It's just showing you the different segments of the rail and how the block signals break them apart. Couple of tips. Block signals, or any signals, have to be to the right-hand side of the rail. So you always want to build them as if you're positioned looking down the rail in the direction the train will go, and you place the signals to the right. If I place it on the left, it's actually going to be set up to signal a train heading in the opposite direction. In our case, we have a single direction rail, so block signals only ever need to be on the right side, following the direction we're heading right now. Another tip is that you don't want to break up your track with lots of tiny little block signals in very short increments. It usually doesn't do you any good unless the segment is at least as long as your train's going to be. Now, in our simple example, we just have one locomotive and one car. Don't worry about that. This methodology all works doesn't matter how many rails or how many cars you have on your train. Starting out by putting a block signal at the beginning and the end of your station will help get things moving. But if we imagine that this loop is multiple kilometers long, we don't necessarily want a train in this long segment and blocking out all other trains just from existing over there. It will work. Right now, as it is, we can put a second train on here and it will work. However, if we break it up a little bit more, then what happens is we actually get more efficient train movement. Now these signals snap into, I'm going to drop that and show you, there's two segments here. They snap into the point at which two pieces of rail connect, so at the seam between the two. So if you need a signal somewhere, maybe I wanted a signal right here, I could delete this section of rail and make two, and then it would let me snap one in place. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and throw one on here, and again, you see how it changed the color? Just to show me that it's breaking these pieces up. And that's all this is about, is I'm trying to just set it up. There's another color change we can see. Now, when that train comes around and it's over here, it's not going to prevent another train from being elsewhere on this long segment. So I'm just putting in some blocks. I'm gonna add another one right there. We should probably also consider adding a block or two in this segment. Again, we're just trying to break that up a little bit so that the train's not so greedy and doesn't lock down such a long section of train. Now that we have that set up, we can actually drop in another train, stick a little freight car on it. See there, now we've got a train. And right over here, I'm just going to go to the train station and edit the timetable of our new train. So I'm just going to call this train B for now. I'm going to edit his timetable and basically say, all right, I want you to go to get some iron, and then I want you to go bring it to the factory. Okay, just trying to keep it simple. We're not worried about flow. And then I'm going to turn on self-driving. He's got his orders. He now knows where to go, and you can see he just started moving because I turned on automatic. Now he skipped this station because I told him to go get iron first. So he'll do that on his next pass. Notice how all his signals are green, but once he gets into a segment, it turns red to let trains behind him know he cannot go that way. Now take a look at this. He slowed down automatically, and he's going to move right up to that signal that says red, and he's going to stop and wait for the other train to clear before he moves. This station, you can see there the signal just turned green. He's going to be able to pull up, and he's going to stop at this station, even though that signal is green, letting him know it's okay. He has to stop here to pick up the iron, because that's what his timetable says. Okay, so we can actually put multiple trains on here. There's really no reasonable limit, but you only want to add trains because of their energy cost. You only want to add trains if you actually need the throughput. So now that we have that all signaled out, we could add more trains. One way to think about it is you definitely don't want more trains than you have segments that can be blocked off by the signaling. But even if we did that, that would still be too many, and the trains would be constantly starting and stopping and starting and stopping, and the acceleration and deceleration waste a lot of time. So you want trains to be going their full speed as much as you possibly can. This particular layout now is pretty well configured. Now I put down here that I don't recommend this particular setup. Why is that? Just simply because trains in station block other trains, and they do have to spend quite a bit of time in station to load and unload. And it's really easy to fix that problem, which we're going to see in the next layout. So let's take a look at a layout that solves that problem. Trains being in station, blocking others from getting by. Let's take a look at this one right here. So right here we have, again, a simple loop. But the only difference is, for the train stations, we've actually made a bit of a bypass, so that trains who don't need to stop at that station can take this bypass and just go right past the area. Whereas if they need to go to that station, they can pull off onto this bypass and they can stop and do their thing. This allows for more efficient train movement compared to our last example. So we have a fictitious factory train stop, we have a fictitious copper station, we have an iron station back there. So let's talk about advantages, disadvantages on this in a little bit more detail. I just call this a loop with station bypasses. I mentioned the efficiency of the train routes, and that's the biggest difference, is that because those trains that don't need to stop at a station can stay full speed and zoom on past, you just get a lot more efficiency and better throughput on your trains. Early on, you may not even realize that you need that later, because a train suddenly provides so much throughput initially, you might not really feel that pressure. But later on, when you need to fix your environment, get more throughput, you want to add another train, you might start to get a little squeezed. There are benefits to this setup in efficiency and throughput. They're not enormous, but they are pretty effective. The other thing it does for us is by taking the trains off of the main line, it actually allows for more trains to be put on this loop than if we didn't have the bypasses. Because trains won't pile up one after another, waiting for one train to get through the station. They will actually stay on the main loop and move and get out of each other's way much faster. And that's a big advantage. The disadvantage here, this will be a little tough to explain, but trains have to run the entire loop. So what if we have a train who is configured to pick up iron like that train is doing, and then bring it over here to the factory. And that's the only thing we need that train to do, is just pick up iron, bring it to the factory. If this loop goes throughout the entire map and covers multiple kilometers worth of track in order to pick up, copper at a station and maybe, 20 other stations, the downside here is that these iron and the factory are relatively close together, this train has to run the full loop just to get back to pick up more iron after it leaves the factory. Now, there's a lot of ways to solve that problem in this kind of a layout. We don't need to go to a dual track example like we'll see out ahead, but we have to think in terms of each train might need a specialty bypass or inner loop. Maybe we connect a big long loop from here all the way back and right back near that station, just so that it doesn't have to run this full distance of all the way out to these other stations like copper and other things it doesn't need. Now, other trains we run might be designated go get copper and come back to the factory, but that train doesn't need to go to iron. So we start getting into a situation where we have to add other bypasses and such in the tracks, additional intersections and additional signaling just to get the train where it needs to go. Not a terrible thing, actually, though. This kind of a layout is fairly optimal. It's not a bad layout by any means. I do actually recommend this kind of a layout. I think it's really good, especially if you're new to trains. This is kind of the first one I'll point you to, is go ahead and run a single track and run it up near every single node you want to gather, set up a bypass for each station, and at that point, you're very expandable. And you can also, instead of putting little bypasses in and inner loops and such to prevent long train runs, you can actually just add more trains. If you have two trains fairly spaced apart, and both of their jobs is to go get that far away copper and come back, even though they have to go past the iron, station as well, they'll still get a lot of throughput. Maybe you need 3 trains, maybe you need 4 trains, depending on how big your loop is, but more trains can also just solve the problem. It's a little bit of a lazy way to do it, but it can actually be pretty effective. Okay, so we only have 1 train in here right now. We have to set up signals in order to get more trains on this track. I always encourage people, however, and all these different kinds of layouts, build your track first, set it up with 1 train, get that working, fully working. Once your 1 train's working, then worry about your signaling to get your 2nd train in place. You want to be thinking about what kind of signaling you need, but the answer is almost always you just need block signals. Very rarely do you need path signals, and I'll keep stressing this. Path signals cause a lot of confusion that is unneeded. They are a tool that you rarely need. If you need it, it's the only answer. Or you might choose pathing to fix an efficiency problem at an intersection. We'll get into that later. Right now, let's just talk about setting up block signals for this loop with bypasses. On this kind of an arrangement, I recommend starting at the stations. And actually, before we even get there, let's go ahead and talk about how intersections work, because we really haven't had to talk about that yet. I want to talk about this little guy too. This is a switch, just a little indicator. Anytime that the track branches, and you can see these 2 segments connect to the same segment, you can literally just branch off another piece. There's a little switch indicator that's automatically added for you. Now the trains are actually set up. You can see this one is defaulting to telling trains to stay on the main track. As this train approaches, he's going to go ahead and use that because he doesn't need to stop at copper. If he did, he would have automatically flipped that switch the other direction. In this case, he needs to go to iron, so he's going to brake to the right. And you can see the little switch. Either he changed it or it was already set that way. But just know that the trains are intelligent enough when they figure out where they need to go next, they know they're going to have to flip that switch when they get close sometimes. These switches you don't really need to worry about. There's rare situations where you have to manually set one. Just know that the trains in their routing will figure it out and know which direction to go. Now over here, if I forcibly flip that switch, and it'll take us a moment here, for this train because he's going to go to the factory. Then he's going to come around. He's actually going to flip this switch so that he can stay on the left track because he doesn't need to go to this station. But it really has nothing to do with the fact that it's a station that he doesn't need. Trains always try and take the shortest route. And their routing is intelligent enough to look at their options and just figure out what the shortest route is. Because this branches out, there's actually more distance in that section than there is here. So this train, when he comes around, and we'll take a look at it. He's coming around now. See that? He just flipped the switch. And he's going to stay to the left because that is a more efficient path for him. So that's all that comes down to. They automatically control those switches when they approach. Okay, so how do we signal this so we can get more than one train in here? If we just threw another train on, eventually they're going to collide. And that's bad. We don't want that to happen. So again, block signals. We're still going to always place our signals on the right because this is the direction we want them to travel. When we get to an intersection, we want to put a block at the beginning of that intersection and on both legs of that exit. There and there. And we can see it's already started to color code. It's set up. I'm going to drop that for a moment. You can see that this signal is green saying, yes, you can come into my block. And these are saying red. And the reason is because that whole other section, and I'll grab a block signal to see it. See all that orange? The whole rest of the track is defined as one segment. So it's effectively, because there's a train somewhere out in the orange, these are blocked. So they're not going to go green until the train gets all the way inside this red section. And then it figures out that, oh, there's no train on the other segment, so it's going to go ahead and flip to green. So that's why it's set up the way it is. So we kind of want to go ahead and add our block signals to the rest of this setup. And I like to set up my rail segments like this. You can see here, I like to have a scene here. Here comes the train here. You can see here, he had to slow down because it was red, but now it flips to green because as soon as he exits here, it knows he's all right. Now that'll clean up once we get the rest of the block signals in. It won't slow him down. So I like to put one there at the end of the train stations so that a train can be in station and it's not going to bother anyone else. Again, this is an intersection, so we always want on entry and exit a block, just like that. Now what we have is that station fully signaled out. Notice how this one is now green, so it's going to let the train enter. Regardless of which way he goes, he's got a lot of green to move all the way up, and this one will flip as the train enters this segment. So I always recommend signal out your stations first, and then worry about anything else. Or do your intersections after your stations. In this case, we have intersections at our stations. So I'm going to zoom on up here, and I'm going to go ahead and signal out these other stations, and I'll do this rather quickly, but you can see, again, staying to the right side of the track based on the direction of the train. Put it at the beginning of our split, the end of our split, so that's broken up. I like to throw one at the end of the station. One here because we're coming into an intersection, and there's the end of that intersection. So we have now blocked out that entire station. And notice the color of the tracks now. Because we have two stations here, this segment is still fairly large, but it's actually broken up now pretty good because these different stations are all signaled. You can see as the train pulls in, the signals are switching, and as soon as he clears that Y, this goes green, letting other trains pass. Well, let's go ahead and come up here and signal out this remaining station. Same way we've done the others. Nothing fancy. We're still just using block signals. Nothing else is really needed for any of this. And in fact, pathing won't help us at all in this layout. Path signals will do nothing for you on this kind of a layout. You only need block signals. I'm going to go ahead and drop that. Now because our loop is, our little demo loop is pretty small, this is actually signaled out pretty well. There's plenty of signals here. Trains will be pretty efficient. If once they get out into this loop, they're going to block this whole part of the loop, but that's not terrible. Still, I do think it's a good idea to just drop in a couple more segments just to allow for smoother train movement. Put that there. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to break up this straight segment and this curve one more time just to give us a little bit more breathing room when there's another train or more trains on the segment. I notice how he's just zooming past that station because there's no train in there right now and he doesn't need it. He's just picking up iron and bringing it to the factory. You can see him pulling into this station now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another train now just so we can see the movement. We'll drop in a locomotive and then I'm going to give him a little freight car. And right now, his rear end's hanging out into that intersection, so it's not going to let any other train move in there. So I'm just going to jump into the train, and I'm going to move him up just a little bit to get out of the way. Okay. So we have another train. Let's go ahead and take a look at the timetable. Here's our new train. We'll call him Train 2. We'll edit his timetable. We're going to tell him to go get copper and bring that to the factory. Remember, the other train is going to get iron and bringing it back to the factory. We're going to go get copper. And I'm going to turn on self-driving. Now, these trains have relatively different tasks. One's getting iron, bringing it to the factory. One's getting copper and bringing it to the factory. You can see the train leaving the factory now, coming down the straight. This train, our copper train, is just starting to move, and notice that they're headed for a collision, but the signal's just flipped to tell them. You can see here this one's red, so he's going to slow down until it turns green. So now they're playing nice. Notice our copper train, he's skipping iron. So that's, again, this layout helps be very efficient. You can also do this kind of layout where you have an inner loop that maybe is only a kilometer in diameter or something around the center of the map. And then when you go out to stations, you actually send two tracks out. You have the track going into the station and the track coming out of the station going far, far away, running in parallel. And keep this bypass in place, nice short little bypass. And that becomes very, very efficient as well. This setup is pretty good. It really is, and you'll find that it's quite efficient. It's not quite the ultimate setup. It's not the one that I typically use unless I have a very small known configuration that I'm dealing with in that particular train run. We'll talk about the final one next. Okay, just a reminder, we've used only block signals so far. We're still going to go back. We're going to set up some pathing on that bidirectional teardrop back there, just so you can see how that works. But first, I wanted to come over and take a look at this layout. And I apologize for the fog. We don't have mods yet, so I can't control the sun's position or anything, so it may get dark on us here. This is a double track setup, and it also implements some kind of roundabout track layouts. This provides us even more flexibility than the previous. We can still entirely use block signals on this setup. Pathing is not required. I'm going to repeat, not required. Pathing can help us, though, be a little more efficient when we have lots and lots of trains on this setup. And this setup does allow for a lot of trains and even better throughput, though it's not a huge impact in most setups. So let's talk about those specifics. Double rail with bypass. So very efficient multiple train routes, and I'll explain why that is. If we take a look at each of these roundabout kind of areas, the train actually has an option. It can just turn around and head back the way it came, or it can break off and go, in this case, to the factory. If we take a look at this roundabout on the end here, the only option is to turn around, but maybe this, imagine our factory is at some dead-end area deep in a valley. That's where we decided to build, so everybody's got to bring all the materials down here. This allows the train to simply turn around and head back out. We're not reusing this segment for bidirectional because that would cause us a lot of pain. Instead, the train can just go and turn around. The other advantage we have with this double track system is I can actually put one of these turnarounds just about anywhere. With a little bit of intersection signaling, we can make it so that trains can turn around just about anywhere in our layout. Remember, this is not a realistic distance. In your real world, you're going to run these tracks a lot farther. We're still using bypasses for our stations because there's great advantages there for not letting trains interfere with each other. Let's come down here and take a look at this intersection. This gets a little complicated. It's really not as scary as it looks, though. We just have to take both rails because this one needs to be able to go to the right, to that factory, and it needs to be able to go straight to turn around. If I come over from this side, this rail, because remember, we're always on the right side. In my example, you can do a left versus right setup on these, but I've done a right. This one has to go to the right till its turnaround. Also might just want to go left to shorten up that circle. In fact, that's the way most will choose to go unless the train coming this way actually needs to turn around, in which case he's going to go to the right. Remember, the train's always looking for the shortest route. So, we know we need signals to make this multi-train. It's the only way we're going to avoid a collision. In a big layout like this with two directional tracks, you can put 2 to 3 trains on it. It'll be quite some time before you get a collision in some cases, but it will happen eventually. So, how do we start signaling something like this? Again, I recommend always starting at a station. Signal that station with your blocks and do all of your stations. So, putting them on the right. I'm just setting them up. You can see we've already blocked out a section of red. Everything else is orange because there's no other signals. Nice and simple. Putting one at the end of that station, putting one there and there. Now we're starting to see some good blocking. Now what happens if I laid these blocks out, these signals out, and one of them is confused, has that kind of yellow exclamation point? I find that when you open them up and you've got an error message here, it's not wonderfully helpful. Sometimes it's more confusing than it is without it. It usually is an indicator that there's a piece of track missing or not properly connected, even if it looks like it is connected. So the best thing to do at that point is actually just to grab a segment, delete it, and recreate it. So I could just grab this section, delete it. I could snap another piece of rail in there and see if that fixes my problem. And redrawing them sometimes will help. Most often if you're using any kind of blueprints, whether you made them or whether they're from the internet or whatnot, that may involve track segments, blueprints tend to break. When you instance them, the rails tend to forget that they're connected, especially at the station juncture, like up here, where we can see where this rail comes into the station. That area can cause problems sometimes. You just delete it, recreate it, and you'll be pretty good to go at that point if you're just using block signals. If you're using a mix of path and block, then you're on your own. There's so many different problems that can occur with those, and I'm not saying never to do it. I'm just saying be ready for a bigger challenge. Okay, once you get comfortable with blocks, though, I do encourage you to start looking at path signals. We're going to talk about those in a little bit. Okay, so I'm pretty much done blocking out this station. I'm going to go ahead and block out the other stations. This one, when floating around here, can sometimes be a little bit tough to get on the right side, or the proper side. That one's all looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and swing on over here and do this one. Sorry about all the spinning. Might be making people nauseous. I'm trying to minimize it. So all these little segments, and they only show up colored like that, little helpers for you when you have a signal, either a block or a path, kind of on your mouse, and you're ready to create it. So that's how you get to look at that, is just grab one off the menu and hold on to it, look around, and you can see all your rail segments. Alright, try and snap that one in there, and that one in there. Okay. I'm still holding one of my signals here just so I can take a look at the coloration and see where all my different rail segments are. I'm going to go down here to this intersection in this roundabout at the bottom of the setup first. I want to talk about this. Anytime we have an intersection, we have to signal. Right now, this is all treated as one big old section. So what's going to happen is, if a train is anywhere in here, it's not going to let another train into this environment. And we don't want that, because that route that train just took was down here, he curved this way, and he went that way. Another train could easily be over here running this loop and headed that way. So we want to give them a little bit more opportunity to share the road, if you will. On top of that, we have an intersection here. So a train coming down this way and going around the loop and heading back could potentially collide with that train that just came through. So that's the main reason for our signaling. Again, we put a block at the beginning, we put a block at the end of each branch. So over there. And that intersection is almost complete. All we've done is handled this direction though. We also want to swing around and we want to look at this direction. We want to do the same thing. We're coming into an intersection. We want to make sure, since this can only go this way and there's already a block here, that's the only one I really need. See how it just turned red? You can see that it switched. Or it just turned green, sorry. Just because that train moved off that segment. Now the coloration helps us quite a bit. Trains are only moving this way, so that kind of isolates that block in the middle. So if a train is in there, no other train is going to be allowed to go into that section. And that's what we want. One thing that I would consider in this setup, because this segment is so small, can't even fit our train in there very well. He's going to actually, as he comes around, he's going to be blocking multiple sections. I could delete this block signal and add one over here instead, just to make that segment a little bigger. It does not want to snap to there. There we go. Or I could just add another signal and break that up again, like so. Either way is good. But I do like to try and give the trains enough movement. Now you look at this long stretch going all the way out here. We just want to break that up into a few more pieces to allow trains to share the road just a little more. And I'll just look for the split and drop some in. Even that one right there, I just broke it in half almost. It's going to make a big difference and really help with our efficiency of movement. Now let's come over to this intersection. Notice this huge section's all pink. Obviously we don't want this intersection all like that because there'll be huge opportunity for collisions. So I'm going to start here. So we've got a train coming this way. We put a block at the start. Which way can he go? He can go to the right. He can go over here. So I want to put that in. And then he can go straight. And I go all the way through and put the block right there. He can't turn onto these strange intersections. He's going to ignore those. He can go to the right and he can go straight. Now the block signals are complaining right now because this is a pretty complex intersection. Best thing I can tell you is just take it step by step, draw in all your signals, and then take a look at it. So here he can go here and he can go there, and I don't have a signal there, so I need one there. Okay, now all we've done so far is this leg and this leg. We have not handled this one. So we're going to go here. There's already a block in that direction, and if I turn left, there's a block in that direction. Now you notice when I dropped that last one, all the little exclamation points, the yellow markers, all disappeared from the block signals. That's because we finally had this intersection properly signaled. And this is a complicated one, and there's a lot of train potential movement. So that's all you need. You notice how we're just on the outside edges, just where the, the start of a split is, and we're telling the trains block to block which way they can go. Now, I'm going to grab a block signal real quick. I just want to talk about this. See how the entire intersection is orange? That means it's basically being handled as if a train is anywhere in there. Watch when the train comes in. Okay. See this one turn red. But really, did it need to? This whole section is treated as one giant thing that only one train can be in at a time. But we know it would be safe, technically, for a train to be traveling down this track while a second train was traveling down that track. They won't collide. Okay, so what if we wanted to be that specific? That's where we would use path signals. And I'll get into that in a little bit. I'm going to do an easier one before we get into that. You can just use block signals, and you really don't lose a lot. We lose that one little intersection not being able to be shared in our layout, and there's another one over there that can maybe be made a little bit more efficient with pathing, with path signals. But for now, this whole thing is built just on block signals. They're nice and easy, and now we can throw a whole bunch of trains in this layout with no problem. You've seen me do that on multiple other layouts. It's pretty straightforward when you're creating another train. I like to not be near other trains, but that's not always possible. Just make sure you're not in a block that already has a train in it. I can just throw a train in here. I'm going to go to another block, and I'm just going to put another train in here as well. Make sure he's facing the right way. Alright, I just added 2 trains. I'm going to go ahead and tell them where to go. Go to our timetable. We have 2 new trains. It just defaults to calling them train. Added their timetable. I'm going to have this one go get quartz and bring it to the factory. Done. Turn on self-driving. That train's done. We're going to go to this train because he hasn't been given any directive. Edit his timetable. I'm going to tell him, go get copper and go get iron. Bring it to the factory. Remember, we're not going to talk about multiple cars, how to load, unload, or any of that. We're just talking about layouts right now. So let's keep it nice and simple in our little demonstration. So he's going to go do his thing. Oops. I forgot to turn on self-driving on that. There we go. Now all 3 trains are going to do their thing. You can see we had a jam up there actually while we were working on it, but that train stopped and waited. A whole bunch of trains all in this section. Notice they can go both directions. They can go into their stations. Everybody's moving along, and all the signaling is working. So this layout really helps us with efficient routing on the trains themselves, because they never have to go down into an area that they have no purpose being in. And this could be several kilometers long. That one could be several kilometers long. These can snake through canyons or whatever. We don't want to send trains where we don't have to, because that time wasted is loss on throughput. This kind of a layout, a double track layout like this, lets the trains only go where they have to go. In fact, if for some reason we had a train layout that was just sending a train too far, we could actually put in one of those intersections you saw up there, a T intersection with a little turnaround, a little roundabout, anywhere we want on this layout. We just then set up the signals, and all the trains can then use that if that's the most efficient route for them to turn around there instead of going down to the next turnaround that they found. The only downside is finding space for those turnarounds. This is the kind of layout that I use when I set up any new environment. I use a double rail, I use all my bypasses for my stations, and I use these roundabouts or turnarounds wherever I need those kinds of things to occur. It's a very expandable environment. It'll support a lot of trains, and is going to give you very efficient throughput. And I can just add more trains anytime I need more throughput into this kind of a setup. Alright. The only thing left to talk about is pathing signals. So far, we have done every one of these layouts without pathing. We couldn't do the double teardrop bidirectional without pathing signals. That one requires them. It's one of the few that does. This layout could benefit in efficiency very, very slightly if we chose to use pathing instead of blocking. I recommend just using blocking on this kind of a layout when you first start. You can always put in pathing later if you want to try it. Okay, let's head over to that double teardrop, which we couldn't get to work with blocking signals. We didn't even try because I can tell you it's not going to result in being able to put multiple trains safely on it. So let's talk about pathing signals. If we remember right on this setup, you can see the train down there on the far end. We just got a little station that's supposedly the train's picking up iron and coming back and bringing it here to the factory station. And we have looped the exit of each station back onto itself for a bidirectional single rail in the middle. And this is why block signals don't work in this kind of setup, because it's a kind of a mix of bidirectional and single directional rails. Block signals simply can't handle this situation. You need pathing signals. It's actually a mix. When you use a path signal, you use a mix of pathing and blocking. So we're going to take a path signal. The difference is a path is always placed at the beginning of a complex intersection, and the next block that it reaches has to be the train exiting that complex intersection. So what we're going to do is we're going to start at this station. I do love starting my signaling at all stations. And we're going to help the trains figure out with a pathing signal how to get through this intersection. Remember, the whole point in using any kind of signaling is to get multiple trains in this environment. I'm going to let him pass so he doesn't get messed up by this. So I'm going to put a path right there. Now that path isn't going to know what to do because he's saying this block doesn't have an exit signal. He needs a block signal on the way out to know what to do. But that still isn't enough, because this path can get to that block, but we still haven't completed this intersection, because when the train comes around the loop, he's coming back into the same intersection and really still doesn't know which way to go. So we're going to put a path, and again, locking that path into where there is a rail split, and then we'll put in a block, and all the way at the end of that intersection, right there. So it's path at the start, block on the exit. So all I did is one path, one block right there. I need another path there, and a block here. Now you notice all the signals are now sort of functional. Okay, trains in the station. This path signal is saying, hey, you can't come in here yet. And that's because of where the train is. As soon as the train comes into this block, the path signal says, I know where you're trying to go. Head for that block signal. So it's basically helping it go where it needs to go, but it needs the train in its segment. The reason that it didn't change while it was sitting here, even though there's no signaling here, is just because the station kind of prevents it from understanding that this is a separate block. Part of that too is just how the segmentation works, but ultimately the station confuses it a bit. So I like to go path, block, and then over here, as if coming this direction, path, block. That's it. That's all that's needed over there. So let's do the same thing down here. So again, train's coming this way. We need a path. We need to tell it, you're going to go this way, and that's a block. Signaling's still confused because we haven't finished the intersection. So I'm just following the track as if I'm the train. I need to come back out here. I need a path out here. And I need a block telling me how to get through this intersection. And that's it. I've now used pathing signals to isolate sections of track, and I'm going to grab any old signal just so we can see the coloration. We can see this yellow segment is separate, this green segment is separate, the bidirectional section here in the orange separate. So these are all places a train can be while there's a train in another segment. Now, this straight section, that's bidirectional, we can never have two trains in here, which means we can't break this up into smaller pieces, which means these teardrops, regardless of how far apart they are, this section is always locked to one train in some direction at any one given moment and can never be shared. That's why I don't recommend this kind of a layout ever, because of the signaling that can be a little confusing to some, and it is horribly inefficient. But now that we are all signaled, I can indeed add a train. Stick them right in there. And then we give them a freight car. And then I'm going to tell them where to go. So the other train's called Hazard. Call that one Duke. We'll edit his timetable. And I'm going to tell him go to Iron, go to the factory. Self-driving. Okay, now if I did everything right, he's going to pull up into that station, very slow because he wasn't moving very quick. He's going to load his iron, and then he's going to move on. Now notice the other train's already here. So he has to wait, because his path signal is saying, hey, you can't come in here, there's somebody else here. Okay, because this block signal is saying, this is not safe. So the path signal reads that block signal and says, nope, not safe yet. So he's going to wait for that train that's in station to pull up around into this arc to get out of the way. You'll see the signals change here in just a moment. And I'm pretty sure I don't have it set up right. Haha, we have a total deadlock. All right, that is less than ideal. What we need to do is we need to make it so that the path signal that this train is sitting at has a clear shot to get all the way into the station. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add another block right there at the end of the station. Now look what happened. This one green, that one green. He can move up and get out of the way now. Now he's going to stop in the station, or he'll be stopped by that signal. Either way is fine. But as soon as he clears the intersection, notice how this one turned green, he can now move. So that one little signal gave us just enough to get through. This is also why I put blocks at the beginning of and end of all of my stations typically, because it just makes things work much cleaner. So now I fixed both. Now we can have two trains realistically on this setup. 3 might still work, but honestly, this is just a horrible setup. So I'll just say it again, don't ever build one of these. They're not efficient. It's much better just to go ahead, if you're going to come out of the station this way, instead of a teardrop, just run another piece of track all the way back, change the direction of that station, and just make a loop. You'll be much happier. This inefficiency of how this whole setup works, the trains spend a lot of time parked, will just kill you through, but okay. We've covered block signals, we've covered path signals a little bit, where they're required. Let's talk about, real quick, where path signals are optional. And I generally don't feel they're worth it in this situation, but they can be used. We'll come over to this intersection. We talked about how a couple trains could technically share this. This train's going to come down this line. Another train could have been in this section over here, no problem. If you remember, I'm going to grab a block just so I can see this. The entirety of that two-way intersection is orange. It's one block. It only lets one train in there at a time. Path signals, what they would do for us, if we swapped out the entrance with a path and the blocks stay, and we just went around and swapped out the entrance with path signals, that would allow multiple trains to operate in that environment. It does add a small amount of efficiency. I do not deny this, but I have never had it impact any of my environment's throughput in any significant way, so I don't bother, generally speaking. Personally, I don't feel path signals are at all valuable except to deal with a complex intersection that you had no choice but to put it in, where block signals don't work, like in a strange multi-directional kind of setup. Just use block signals, save yourself a lot of pain, use path when you know you need it, and if you're not sure if you need it, you probably don't, or you should probably change your train layout so that you don't need them, just to keep things simple. Avoid sharing a single rail multi-direction. That's probably the best advice I can give you in dealing with trains in Satisfactory. It's just not worth the headache. If you're up for the challenge, have at it. Don't tell anybody how they have to play. These are just my suggestions. Thank you everyone for watching this video. Please like and subscribe.